They laughed when they saw her name, not because it was funny, but because it belonged to someone they believed would never belong in a place like this. Monroe, the daughter of the janitor. She hadn't even made it past the reception desk before the judgment started rolling in like a wave. But Eliza Monroe didn't flinch, not this time. She was used to walking into rooms that didn't want her there. What they didn't know was that she'd spent years preparing for this exact moment. That morning, Eliza had left her small apartment before the sun rose. The neighborhood was quiet, the streets still washed in blue-gray shadows. Her hands were cold, gripping the worn leather folder she carried like it was a shield. Inside were 5 copies of her resume, typed out carefully at the library, printed with coins she had begged, borrowed, and scraped together over weeks. The blazer she wore was 2 sizes too big, borrowed from her neighbor who had told her she looked sharp. The shoes had seen better days, the soles worn thin from years of walking with purpose. But it didn't matter, because none of those things told the full story of who she was. She stepped off the bus and stood in front of the building that had once felt like a castle. Bright Tech Innovations, 32 stories of gleaming glass and steel. She'd seen this building from every angle, mostly from the back-loading dock when her father used to bring her along after school. He was the janitor here for nearly a decade. Never late, never absent, never noticed. She'd sit quietly in a corner while he polished floors and emptied trash cans. But Eliza wasn't just watching. She was learning, observing the patterns of people, the language of workspaces, the structure beneath the surface. She absorbed everything like a sponge. Data dashboards she saw through glass office walls, meeting notes left behind on whiteboards, the cadence of corporate jargon drifting through the air vents. This place raised her as much as any classroom ever did. Now she stood on the threshold of that same building, heart pounding. Not as the janitor's daughter, but as a candidate, a woman with ideas, someone who believed, despite everything, that she belonged. She took a deep breath and stepped through the revolving doors. The lobby was polished to perfection. The marble floor shone like a mirror beneath her. Every footstep echoed. Every detail screamed wealth, success, and gatekeeping. Behind the front desk sat a receptionist with hair too perfect to move, nails like polished glass. She looked up, smile frozen in place, then glanced down at Eliza's shoes. Her smile faded. "Can I help you?" The words came out slow, thick with doubt. Eliza's voice was steady. "I have a 10:30 interview, junior analyst position." The receptionist raised a perfectly shaped brow, fingers already moving across the keyboard. "Name? Eliza Monroe." That did it. The woman actually laughed, a quick, sharp sound like a balloon popping. "Monroe? As in Chuck Monroe, the janitor?" There was a pause. The air in the room changed. 2 men in expensive suits nearby turned their heads. One of them smirked. Eliza's fingers clenched around her folder, but she didn't back down. The receptionist leaned in slightly, her tone now dripping with condescension. "This is a corporate office, sweetheart, not a career fair." "I'm here for a scheduled interview," Eliza repeated, quieter now but unshaken. "Please check the list." She didn't expect an apology, but what came next was worse. The receptionist didn't move to check anything. Instead, she tapped something on her desk, and seconds later a security guard appeared at the edge of the lobby, posture already dismissive. eyes already narrowing. Eliza turned to face him. "I'm on the schedule, you can check." The receptionist didn't even bother hiding her disdain. "Look, maybe there was a mistake. This floor is not open to the public. Perhaps you should come back with your father." The words sliced through her. She had spent years trying to prove she was more than a name, more than a background, more than someone who knew the building from behind a mop bucket. She opened her mouth to insist again, but just then the energy in the room shifted. A voice thundered from behind the front desk, laced with frustration and urgency. "Where is the analyst who can fix this disaster? We have a board meeting in 2 hours and no one even understands the report." Silence fell. Even the receptionist straightened in her seat. The security guard stepped back. A tall man in a navy suit came storming around the corner, a thick file in his hands and a storm in his expression. And in that moment, Eliza saw what no one else did. An opening. Not an opportunity handed to her, but one she was going to take. The man in the suit moved like a force of nature, controlled but barely. His jaw was clenched, his stride sharp, and the way he held that folder made it clear someone, somewhere, had made a very costly mistake. The room tensed around him. Phones were lowered mid-scroll, conversations stopped mid-sentence. He didn't bother to look at anyone as he shouted again, this time louder, angrier, his voice echoing off the glass and marble like a thunderclap. "We are running out of time. Where is the analyst who can explain this? I've got 15 people waiting in a boardroom, and not one of you can tell me why these numbers are falling apart." No one moved. Not the receptionist, not the security guard, not even the suited men who had chuckled at Eliza just moments before. Every set of eyes shifted nervously. No one stepped forward, no one spoke up. And then, like instinct, Eliza did. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the tension like a blade. "I can try." For a second, the world went completely still. Even the distant humming of the elevators seemed to pause. The CEO turned his head slowly, his brow furrowing as he looked her over. First her face, then her outfit, then the battered folder still clutched against her chest. His gaze lingered on her shoes, the same ones the receptionist had judged so harshly. He looked almost amused, like someone just told him the janitor's daughter was auditioning to be a surgeon. "You?" he said, not hiding the disbelief. "Who are you?" "Eliza Monroe," she answered without hesitation, though her heart pounded like a drum in her chest. "I was scheduled for an interview this morning, but it seems like this is more urgent." The receptionist let out a noise, something between a scoff and a chuckle, but the CEO didn't take his eyes off Eliza. He looked at her differently now, not kindly, not harshly, just curiously, like he was trying to decide if what he'd heard was ridiculous or revolutionary. "You think you can fix a financial model that my entire analytics department couldn't untangle? A report that's been ripped apart by our most expensive consultants and still makes no sense?" Eliza didn't flinch. "I know I don't have a degree, and I don't have a title, but I've studied every open report this company has published in the last 3 years. I've run simulations at the library with no software and no help, and I've watched this building operate, closer than anyone thinks. I might not have credentials, but I understand how your numbers move." The guard, still hovering nearby, shifted awkwardly, unsure if he was supposed to escort her out or stand at attention. The receptionist's smirk was gone. She now watched Eliza like someone realizing they might have made a very public mistake. Eliza could feel the heat in her neck, the way her fingers trembled slightly around her folder, but she didn't look away. She didn't back down. "Give me 5 minutes with the report," she said. "If I can't find the issue, I'll walk out and you'll never hear from me again. But if I'm right, I just ask for a chance." The CEO stared at her for what felt like forever. Behind him, a few more employees had quietly gathered, drawn to the sudden silence and the presence of someone challenging the top of the food chain. The tension in the room crackled. Then, finally, he spoke. "5 minutes," he said. "No more." He shoved the thick folder into her hands and turned on his heel. "Conference room's open," he called out. "Let's see if the janitor's daughter can do what the MBAs couldn't." Eliza exhaled, forcing her legs to move as she walked past the security guard, past the receptionist whose mouth had opened slightly in stunned silence, past the suits who had looked down on her, and into the sleek glass-walled room where reputations were made or destroyed. Every step felt like walking a tightrope above everything she'd ever feared, and everything she'd ever wanted. The door closed behind her with a soft but final click, sealing her inside the glass conference room like a trial chamber. Outside, a dozen eyes watched her through the transparent walls, some curious, some skeptical, most expecting her to fail. Inside, it was just her, the echo of her own heartbeat, and the weight of the thick report in her hands. The table stretched long and polished before her, and she took the seat at its head not because anyone told her to, but because that's where someone sits when they've decided to stop asking for permission. She laid her folder down carefully and opened the report, spreading out the pages like a puzzle she had been preparing her whole life to solve. The numbers stared back at her, rows and columns that most would find dizzying, projections layered with uncertainty, variables linked like an intricate machine. To someone else, it was chaos. To her, it was familiar. She'd seen enough of this company's public reports, annual filings, and investor updates to know the patterns, the language, even the mistakes. She flipped through the pages quickly, her eyes scanning for the inconsistencies, the sudden shifts, the gaps that didn't add up. There was something wrong with the material cost curves. She could feel it, even if she couldn't yet prove it. Eliza pulled a pen from her folder and began scribbling notes on a blank sheet, corrections, questions, possible causes. The numbers weren't just wrong, they were skewed in a very specific way. She turned back to the procurement section where the supply chain assumptions had been listed. That's where it hit her. One line item was off, not removed, but faded, almost like someone had copied over an old spreadsheet without realizing the data had expired. A material contract had ended earlier than scheduled, but the system hadn't flagged it. That one error had cascaded through every projection model that followed, making the company's second quarter outlook look far better than it actually was. The realization snapped into place like the final piece of a lock. She didn't need software to see it. She didn't need a degree. She needed her mind, her instincts, and the hours of quiet learning she'd done alone, unpaid, unseen. She pulled out the last 2 years of public quarterly summaries from her folder, notes she had annotated on her own time, and used them to validate the change. The contract hadn't been renewed. The pricing assumptions were based on terms that no longer existed. Every future projection built on top of that mistake was useless. She circled the key figures and wrote a recalculated version of the formula, adjusting for the corrected supplier cost. It was crude, done with a ballpoint pen and a piece of ruled paper, but it was accurate. She double-checked her math, then triple-checked it. She glanced at the clock on the wall. 4 minutes, 1 minute left. She organized the marked pages into a clean stack, picked them up, and stood. Outside the glass walls, the CEO leaned against a column, arms crossed, pretending not to care, but his eyes were locked on her. Several employees had now gathered in a quiet cluster, whispering to each other like they were waiting for a twist ending to a movie. The receptionist sat motionless, her screen glowing but untouched. The security guard was still nearby, though his posture had changed, no longer ready to intervene, just watching. Eliza stepped out of the room, her movements calm and controlled, despite the pounding in her chest. She walked straight to the CEO and held out the marked report. "There's your problem," she said, her voice steady. "Your analysts missed a supplier contract that expired early. It's buried in the assumptions. It distorted your cost curve and invalidated the second quarter projections. But if you adjust the material input model and correct the formula at its source, the rest of the data realigns." He didn't take the paper immediately. He looked at her face, searching for hesitation, signs of bluffing, anything to suggest she wasn't as confident as she sounded. Then he reached for the report and scanned her annotations. He called over his assistant, who approached quickly, confusion flickering across his face until he saw the pages. Eliza watched silently as the assistant cross-referenced the data with his tablet, tapping, scrolling, then freezing. "She's right," he said. "Completely right." For a moment the CEO said nothing. Then he looked up again, not at her shoes, not at her clothes, not at her last name, but at her, really at her, and the air around them shifted. The receptionist sat a little straighter. The gathered employees fell silent. Even the security guard seemed to take a deeper breath, because what had just happened wasn't just surprising. It was undeniable. The janitor's daughter had done in 5 minutes what no one else in the building could. For a long moment, no one said a word. The weight of what had just happened settled over the lobby like a thick fog. The CEO, Douglas Blake, held the marked-up report in one hand, the edges slightly curled from Eliza's grip, the notes written in a simple ballpoint pen standing out starkly against the typed financials. His assistant still hovered beside him, glancing between the report and Eliza, as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. The receptionist had frozen in place, lips parted, fingers still resting on her keyboard, as if the command to dismiss Eliza had gotten stuck in her throat. And the men in suits, the ones who had laughed when they heard her last name, they were silent now too, not out of respect, out of confusion. They were watching the rules change in real time, and none of them were quite sure what came next. Then Blake looked up from the report. He didn't raise his voice this time. He didn't make a show of anything. He just said, with a voice low and final, "Cancel the rest of the interviews." It wasn't a suggestion. It was an order. The receptionist blinked, hesitated for half a second, then nodded silently and reached for her phone. The lobby seemed to hold its breath. Blake looked back at Eliza and motioned for her to follow. He didn't ask if she was available. He didn't need to. "Come with me," he said, and turned down the hallway. Eliza hesitated only for a second before moving. Her legs carried her forward on pure instinct. As she walked past the receptionist's desk again, She saw the woman lower her eyes, the condescension gone, replaced by something closer to shame or disbelief. The same path she had walked moments before, shadowed by the threat of being escorted out, now unfolded before her like an invitation. She could still feel the judgment hanging in the air behind her, but it didn't matter. She had already shattered the first ceiling, and she wasn't turning back. The hallways of Bright Tech were just as sleek and polished as she remembered. Cold glass, gleaming tile, walls lined with plaques and innovation awards. But they felt different now. She wasn't trailing behind her father's janitor cart. She wasn't peeking into offices when no one was looking. She was walking side by side with the most powerful man in the company, and for the first time, people weren't ignoring her. They were watching. Whispers followed in her wake. Employees stepped aside, uncertain, intrigued. Some of them recognized her, not by name, but by the memory of seeing her tucked away in a corner of the building years ago, too quiet to be noticed. Now she was unforgettable. Blake didn't speak as they walked. His strides were long and fast, driven by a mind already working through what had just happened. Eliza matched his pace, her mind racing even faster. She didn't know where they were going. She didn't know what he would ask. But something had shifted in the chemistry of the building, in the unspoken rules of who belongs and who decides, and she wasn't about to waste the moment. They reached a set of glass double doors that led into a secured section of the executive wing. A soft beep sounded as Blake swiped his ID. The doors opened and they stepped into a space Eliza had only ever imagined. Long tables covered in devices and charts, walls alive with screens showing live data streams, market fluctuations, news tickers, and internal analytics. It was the war room, the place where decisions that moved markets were made, and now she stood inside it. Blake gestured toward the end of the room where a smaller conference space was enclosed behind sliding glass panels. "In here," he said. She followed him inside, and as the doors closed behind them, he turned to face her directly for the first time since the lobby. "Explain it to me," he said. "Not like I'm a board member, not like I'm your boss. Explain it like you see it." Eliza took a breath. This was the moment everything in her life had been building toward. The hours at the library, the nights watching YouTube lectures on economics through a cracked phone screen, the notebooks full of handwritten summaries of Bright Tech reports, the quiet calculations scribbled on the backs of her dad's janitorial checklists. She didn't need a script. She didn't need slides. She just needed her mind and the truth. "The issue wasn't in the final numbers," she began. "It was in the assumptions. Your team built the model based on cost inputs from last quarter, but one of your key suppliers ended their contract early. It wasn't flagged because the system didn't register the early termination clause. So every cost estimate for that material is off. That affected your projected margins, the forecasted ROI, everything." Blake listened without interrupting. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes were sharp. She continued, "Your analysts didn't catch it because they were looking at top-level indicators, but I've been studying your reports for years. Public filings, internal data, whatever I could get my hands on. I recognized the supplier code. It was buried in last year's procurement summaries. The change wasn't reflected in the assumptions because the formula didn't update the expiry dates dynamically." Blake crossed his arms and stepped back slightly, processing. "You don't have a degree. You've never worked for a company like this. So how is it that you saw something my senior team didn't? Eliza's answer was simple. Because I wasn't trained to look at what they see. I was trained to see what others miss. There was a pause, long, weighty. Then Blake shook his head slowly, not in disbelief, but in some private realization. He turned to the wall of screens and stood in silence for a few seconds, watching as graphs shifted and new numbers populated. Then he spoke again, his voice lower, thoughtful. I don't want you as a junior analyst. The words hit Eliza like a slap. Her heart dropped. For a moment, she thought he was dismissing her again, that this was all some cruel test. But then he turned around. I want you to lead something we don't have yet, a team dedicated to accuracy, to finding what others overlook, to breaking our assumptions before they cost us millions. You don't come from where my other hires come from, but that's exactly why you can see what they can't. She blinked. You want me to lead a team? Blake nodded, starting now. And just like that, the janitor's daughter wasn't just part of the company, she was about to change it. Eliza didn't sleep that night, not because she was worried, though she had every reason to be, but because her mind wouldn't stop moving. It kept spinning through variables, replaying every second of the day over and over again. The lobby, the glass room, the moment she'd stood up with nothing but scribbled notes and a gut feeling, and had been right. She couldn't turn it off. Her heart raced just thinking about what had happened and what was coming. She wasn't dreaming anymore. She was living something she couldn't have imagined even if she tried. But with that came something heavier than fear, responsibility, pressure. She wasn't being given a second interview, a pat on the back, or a slow onboarding process. She had been handed something big, something delicate, something no one else in the company even knew how to define yet, and she had to make it real. By sunrise, she was already dressed. Same notebook, same shoes, same fire in her chest. She hadn't told her father the whole story yet, just that the interview had gone better than expected. She wanted to tell him everything, but part of her still didn't believe it herself. So instead, she kissed him on the cheek, grabbed the banana he'd left on the counter for her, and caught the early bus, trying to steady the storm inside her. When she walked through the front doors of Bright Tech, the lobby felt different. Or maybe she did. The marble floors still gleamed, the receptionist still sat at her desk, but something had shifted. People noticed her. Some looked twice, some quickly looked away, uncertain. One man nodded awkwardly as she passed, and a woman by the elevator nudged her co-worker, whispering something under her breath. The air was filled with something new. Whispers, curiosity, maybe even respect. But none of that mattered to Eliza. She wasn't here to be admired. She was here to deliver. The elevator climbed floor after floor, and as it opened on the executive level, the floor she had once believed was reserved for people who belonged to another world, she found Douglas Blake waiting for her. He didn't greet her with fanfare. He didn't offer encouragement. He just looked her in the eye and said, "You ready?" She nodded. "Yes." "Good," he said. "Let me introduce you to your team." She followed him into a boardroom with glass walls and high ceilings. Around the table sat 5 people, a senior finance director with decades of experience, 2 data specialists known for their efficiency, a junior executive who looked barely older than Eliza, and one of the very analysts whose mistake she had uncovered 2 days before. No one smiled, no one offered a handshake, They watched her with the guarded expressions of people trying to figure out what game they were suddenly playing and whether this new player even belonged at the table. Blake didn't give them much time to wonder. "This is Eliza Monroe," he said, voice firm and direct. "She'll be leading the new accuracy task force, effective immediately." He looked around the room, holding eye contact with each person. "She's here because she caught a failure the rest of us missed. You're here because you can help her make sure it never happens again." With that, he turned to Eliza. "The floor is yours." Every heartbeat echoed in her ears, but she stepped forward, notebook in hand, spine straight. "I know I don't look like what you expected," she said, her voice clear, steady. "And I know you're all wondering why I'm here, what I could possibly know that someone with your background doesn't. So I'll tell you, I'm not here to replace anyone. I'm not here to prove I'm smarter than anyone. I'm here because I saw something others missed. Not because I'm better, but because I look at things differently. That's what this team is about. Not blame, not perfection. Just clarity, just truth." There was silence, and then she opened her notebook and began outlining her first proposal. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't wrapped in corporate buzzwords. It was raw and practical. A plan to audit every cost projection going forward, not just based on data, but on context. Supplier terms, contract loopholes, update cycles, things that got buried when people assumed everything was running smoothly. She talked about implementing redundancy checks using open-source tools. She laid out a rough design for a real-time flagging system that would catch anomalies before they snowballed. And she did it all without jargon, without ego, without apology. One of the data specialists leaned forward, intrigued. The junior executive jotted something down. Even the finance director's posture shifted slightly. Less guarded, more thoughtful. But it was the analyst, the one whose mistake had started this entire spiral, who spoke first after she finished. He looked at her across the table, his expression unreadable. Then he said quietly, "You saw what I didn't." That took guts. Eliza nodded. Mistakes happen. It's how we handle them that matters. By the end of the hour, the room had changed. Not completely, not magically, but the tension had begun to crack. They didn't all accept her yet, but they were listening. That was enough. She didn't demand their respect. She was earning it, one idea at a time. And when the meeting ended, Blake didn't say a word. He simply looked at her, then at the others, and walked out of the room like a man who already knew what they were just beginning to realize. The janitor's daughter wasn't a fluke. She was the future. The door to the executive boardroom closed behind her with a gentle thud, but the weight of what had just happened clung to Eliza like a second skin. She stood still for a moment in the corridor, letting it sink in. Not the title, not the stares, not even the victory of having been heard. What stayed with her most was the shift in atmosphere, the subtle but undeniable change in how people were starting to see her. They still didn't fully understand who she was, but for the first time, they weren't looking through her. They were paying attention. She made her way down the corridor, unsure where she was supposed to go next, but unwilling to ask. She didn't need someone to hold her hand. Every step forward, every hallway she passed, every head that turned to glance her way felt like a silent test. She was being watched, but not as a guest. She was something else now, something they didn't quite know how to label. Not an intern, not an outsider. She had been pulled into the core of Bright-Tech's ecosystem through the side door, and no one knew what to make of it, including her. She wandered into a small break area tucked between the executive wing and the operations floor. The coffee machine was humming softly, and a few employees stood nearby, talking in low voices. Their conversation paused the moment they saw her, not out of rudeness, but curiosity. No one said her name, but she heard it anyway. One of the men nodded stiffly, then returned to his mug. Another woman gave her a polite half-smile, the kind that comes from someone realizing they may have underestimated you. Eliza nodded back and poured herself a cup of coffee, her hands surprisingly steady. As the steam rose, she remembered how many times she'd stood in that very space before, not as a guest, not as an employee, but as the janitor's daughter waiting patiently while her father changed trash bags and wiped down counters. No one had spoken to her then. She'd been invisible, but now, the same walls, the same polished tile, the same corporate chatter, but a completely different lens. She wasn't just in the building now, she was in the system. Later that afternoon, Douglas Blake summoned her again, this time to his personal office. It was the corner suite, of course, 2 walls made entirely of glass, overlooking the city skyline with a view that screamed power and distance. His desk was large but uncluttered. Behind it, shelves full of awards, business books, framed magazine covers. Eliza stepped inside, and Blake didn't offer small talk. He simply gestured for her to sit and got straight to the point. "The board meeting is in 2 days," he said. "I want you to present." Eliza blinked. "Me?" "You found the flaw," he said. "You corrected it. You proposed the new system. No one else here understands it the way you do. And if we're serious about changing the way this company operates, then it starts now, with you." Her first instinct was to say no. She wasn't ready. She didn't know the protocol. She didn't have the polish. The idea of standing in front of the board, the same board that ran one of the most influential tech firms in the country, was like being told to perform surgery with no tools. But then she looked at Blake, and something in his eyes stopped her. He wasn't testing her. He wasn't setting her up to fail. He was handing her the reins. "I don't need you to be perfect," he said, as if reading her thoughts. "I need you to be right. The rest we can build." She nodded slowly, the words catching in her chest before she forced them out. "Okay, I'll do it." For the next 48 hours, Eliza didn't go home. She slept for an hour on a break room couch, fueled herself with vending machine granola bars and cold coffee, and worked through every hour like a woman on fire. She had access now. Access to internal reports, dashboards, real-time analytics, tools she had only dreamed of before. She pored over every document, not just checking for errors, but building the foundation for a system that wouldn't need last-minute miracles anymore. A system that would catch problems before they became disasters. A system that didn't rely on luck or a gut feeling, but could still recognize the value of both. By the time the boardroom lights dimmed and the chairs were filled with Bright-Tech's most powerful voices, Eliza stood at the front of the room with her notes in one hand and a clicker in the other. Her blazer was the same borrowed one she'd worn to the interview. Her shoes were still worn at the edges, but her voice, when she finally spoke, was clear, confident, and unapologetically hers. Douglas Blake sat beside her, arms folded, silent but present. His presence alone told the board that she wasn't just a guest. She was his choice. The presentation began, and with every slide, with every figure explained and error unraveled, the boardroom grew quieter. They weren't just listening, they were learning. And by the time she finished, there wasn't a single raised voice. Just silence, then murmurs, then questions, serious ones, thoughtful ones. She answered every one, because for the first time in her life, she wasn't just proving that she belonged, she was redefining what it meant to. The silence that followed Eliza's final slide stretched longer than she expected. For a moment, she couldn't tell if it was the kind of silence that meant confusion or the kind that came before applause. Her heart pounded in her ears, her fingers still tight around the presentation remote as she glanced across the boardroom. 15 members of Brighttech's executive board sat in upholstered chairs, their faces hard to read, some resting their chins on their knuckles, some with arms crossed, others leaning slightly forward, eyes narrowed as if still processing what they'd just heard. At the head of the table, Douglas Blake sat quietly, his gaze steady on the board rather than her, as if daring them to challenge what they'd seen. Then one board member, a man in his 60s, gray temples, perfectly tailored suit, spoke up. He leaned forward, folding his hands. "Where did you say you went to school?" Eliza paused, the question landing like a challenge. She looked him in the eye, her voice steady. "I didn't. I was raised in this building. My father worked here as a janitor for nearly 3 decades. I learned everything on my own, through public data, online courses, borrowed books, and watching this company more closely than you might imagine." A ripple moved through the room. Some eyebrows rose. One woman glanced sideways at her colleague. Another reached for her pen and made a quiet note. The man who'd asked the question didn't respond right away. He looked down at the notes in front of him, then back up at her. And then Douglas spoke. "Her education came from the same floors your shoes walk across every day. While you were reviewing sanitized reports in quarterly meetings, she was sweeping behind your chairs and memorizing your dashboards. She doesn't have a degree on her resume, but today none of those degrees mattered. Only results did." A silence heavier than before settled over the room. No one rebutted, no one scoffed. Instead, a different kind of energy crept in, one not built on skepticism, but on reluctant respect. Then the chairman of the board, a sharp-eyed woman with a voice that could cut through steel, spoke. "The numbers she fixed, are they stable now?" she asked the CFO, who had been sitting silently in the corner until now. "They're clean," the CFO replied. "Confirmed by 2 separate teams since this morning, and her audit framework. It's aggressive, but it's scalable. If implemented, it'll not only prevent repeat errors, but flag blind spots before they impact reporting." The chairman nodded once, then turned back to Eliza. "And you're prepared to lead this initiative full-time?" Eliza hesitated for just a second, but not because she doubted herself. She was thinking about the scope, the responsibility, the fact that she hadn't even seen an employment contract yet. But then she met Blake's eyes, steady, expectant, and the doubt melted. "Yes," she said, "I'm prepared, and I know I have more to learn, but I've already started." The board conferred in low voices for a moment, murmurs and nods passing around the table like a ripple in still water. Then the chairman stood. "We accept the proposal, and we approve the creation of a new department under your leadership, effective immediately. It will report directly to the executive team. Name it what you like." Eliza blinked. She thought she had misheard. Under my leadership? Blake smiled faintly. That's what you just earned. She didn't respond right away. Her hands were still holding the clicker, but her entire body felt like it was floating. It wasn't just that the board had agreed. It was that the board had shifted. They didn't just accept her presence. They endorsed her authority, and no matter how reluctant or surprised they might have been, it was written into the minutes now. It was real. As the meeting ended and board members stood to leave, some gave her polite nods, others thoughtful glances. One even offered a quiet, "well done," as he passed her by. When she gathered her papers and stepped out of the boardroom, her legs trembled slightly, the adrenaline finally catching up with her, but she didn't collapse under it. She walked forward. Outside the executive suite, her phone buzzed. She pulled it from her pocket. A message from her father. How did it go? She stared at the screen for a moment, then typed back, "I think I just got promoted." And then she smiled, blinking back a rush of unexpected tears. Later that evening, as the sky darkened and the building began to empty, Eliza stood on the rooftop terrace just off the executive lounge. The city lights blinked like stars below her, and the breeze moved through her borrowed blazer like a whisper of everything she'd fought to reach. She looked up at the glowing logo on the building's tower, Bright Tech, and for the first time, it didn't feel like something above her. It felt like something she was inside, something she was shaping. And beneath that sky, she said it softly, just for herself, "I belong." The next morning arrived with the kind of quiet wait that follows a storm. Eliza woke before her alarm, already dressed in her thoughts before her feet even hit the floor. The sun had barely risen, casting soft gold over the city skyline as she stood by the window of her small apartment, holding a mug of tea that had long gone cold in her hands. Today wasn't just another day. It was her first as a department head. Those words didn't even feel real yet, but the weight of them rested on her shoulders like armor, not heavy, but powerful. She wasn't just stepping into a new job. She was stepping into a story that people would talk about for years, whether they liked it or not. Her father was already up, dressed in his uniform, lunchbox in hand. They met in the kitchen, silent for a few moments. He didn't ask questions, he never had, but his eyes, deep, steady, proud, held something that told her he already knew. She reached over and adjusted the strap on his shoulder, a simple gesture that said more than words ever could. "Wish me luck," she whispered. He smiled, kissed the top of her head gently, and simply said, "You don't need it." At 8:05 a.m., she stepped back into the same building that had once tried to turn her away. But now, the front doors didn't feel like a wall, they felt like a gateway. The same receptionist from days ago caught sight of her and stood a little straighter, her eyes flickering with something that wasn't quite regret, but wasn't far from it. She didn't say anything this time, just nodded once, respectfully. Eliza nodded back, without bitterness. She didn't need to remind anyone who she was. Her work had done that already. As the elevator climbed to the 22nd floor, Eliza took a deep breath, her fingers brushing over the edge of the small notebook in her hand. It was filled with pages of ideas, questions, and thoughts scribbled late into the night. This notebook wasn't fancy, no leather binding, no embossed name on the front, but it was hers, and in many ways it was the blueprint of her future. When the doors opened, Douglas Blake was already there, waiting. No assistants, no entourage, just him, arms crossed, his face unreadable. He studied her for a moment before speaking. "They're inside," he said. "They're waiting." She nodded. He didn't need to say more. He stepped aside, and she walked past him through the glass double doors, into a room that now belonged to her. 5 people sat at the long whiteboard table. All of them had resumes more polished than hers. Degrees, experience, names on reports and analytics patents, but none of them had done what she had done in the past 3 days. And that mattered now. Some looked at her with interest, others with caution, a few with barely concealed skepticism. She could feel it, the tension hanging between curiosity and doubt. But this time, she didn't let it shake her. She stepped to the front, dropped her notebook on the table, and began to speak. "I know what most of you are thinking. I didn't come up through the traditional path. I don't have credentials that impress on paper. And yet, here I am. I'm not here to compete with your experience or question your intelligence. I'm here to lead something new, something that this company has never tried before, a department that exists not to replace what's working, but to fix what gets overlooked." She paused, then wrote 3 words on the whiteboard behind her: truth, detail, accountability. This task force isn't about catching mistakes to embarrass people. It's about protecting the company from the quiet errors that cost millions. We're not just checking numbers, we're checking the thinking behind them. That means asking hard questions, testing assumptions, and yes, challenging reports that look perfectly fine on the surface. The room stayed quiet, but something shifted. The analyst who had made the error last week crossed his arms, but not in defiance. It was something closer to guarded respect. One of the data specialists leaned in slightly, scribbling a note. "We're going to build a system that looks for the cracks, not just in the data, but in the process. We'll audit not just the outcomes, but the logic. We'll flag what others ignore, and we'll do it together. I'm not here to bark orders. I'm here to learn with you, grow with you, and get results that speak for themselves." She laid out the first initiative, a trial run of the audit protocol she'd proposed to the board. It would target 3 recent forecasts and walk backward through the assumptions. Not to lay blame, but to prove how easy it is to miss small details that can shift everything. One by one, the team members started engaging. Questions were asked, challenges were raised, but every time Eliza responded with clarity, not arrogance. When she didn't know something, she admitted it and followed up with a plan to find out. She didn't dominate the room, she directed it, and slowly the atmosphere changed. By the end of the meeting, no one was looking at her like an outsider anymore. They weren't calling her the janitor's daughter. They were calling her Eliza. Some still had doubts, sure, but doubt was welcome. It meant they were thinking. It meant they were taking her seriously, and that was all she ever wanted. That afternoon, they started work on their first recalibration project. Eliza walked the floor, asking questions, pulling people into quiet one-on-ones to understand their methods. She didn't pretend to know everything. She listened, she learned, she connected dots others hadn't noticed. She caught a data input error within the first 2 hours that would have snowballed into a massive misreporting if left alone. She flagged it gently, explained her reasoning, and asked the specialist how they'd like to fix it together. And that changed everything. By the end of the day, Her team didn't just tolerate her, they began to trust her. Not because of her title, but because of how she moved through the room, how she handled mistakes, how she respected their skills while sharpening them with her own. And when the sun dipped low, casting amber across the office windows, Douglas Blake watched from his glass-walled office as Eliza walked the rows between desks, sleeves rolled up, notebook in hand, nodding as her team discussed recalibration metrics. His assistant stepped in behind him quietly. "Sir, the board presentation follow-up. Should I prepare a deck?" Blake didn't even look away from the window. "No," he said. "She will." The assistant hesitated. "Eliza, but she's new." Blake finally turned, and there was something firm, almost defiant in his voice when he replied, "She's not new, she's next." 2 days later, the executive boardroom gleamed with the same polished intensity Eliza remembered, but this time she didn't feel small in it. The long table was lined with figures who could shift the direction of an entire industry with a single vote, men and women who had built empires on sharp decisions and sharper instincts. Their suits were custom, their pens gold-plated, and their time was tracked to the minute. These were people used to being impressed, but rarely surprised, and certainly not by someone like her. But Eliza wasn't here to impress them with flash. She wasn't here to sell them a dream or hide behind buzzwords. She was here with truth, backed by numbers, logic, and a kind of hunger that couldn't be taught. She stood at the front of the room beside the projection screen, her notes organized into a crisp, well-worn folder, her name, Eliza Monroe, printed at the top of the agenda in bold. That name had once been laughed at in this building. Now it was underlined. The meeting began without ceremony. Douglas Blake opened with a short statement, but he didn't drag it out. "We've already discussed the flaw found in the previous quarter's report. Today, you're going to hear how it was fixed, why it happened in the first place, and what systems are being implemented to ensure it never happens again. Eliza, the floor is yours." She stepped forward, her heels clicking quietly against the floor. Every face turned to her, some curious, some skeptical, a few unreadable, but none dismissive, not anymore. She began not with an apology, not with a greeting, but with the facts. 2 weeks ago, she said, our Q2 projections showed an increase in operating margins by 2.3%. This spike triggered internal optimism and influenced early-stage investment conversations. But the spike wasn't real. It was built on an error, specifically a reliance on an outdated supplier contract that had quietly expired 3 weeks before the report was generated. The result was a distortion of raw material input costs across 4 product lines. She clicked the remote. A chart appeared behind her showing side-by-side comparisons. The numbers were clear, and the mistake was easy to trace once it had been spotted. Her voice didn't shake. She didn't hide behind technical jargon or stumble through qualifiers. She told them exactly how it happened, exactly why it mattered, and exactly what needed to be done. I'm not here to criticize the analytics team. These things happen when you're moving fast and trusting automated systems. But what we missed wasn't just a line of data, it was the human oversight behind that data. The assumption that systems work until they don't. Then she laid out her plan, layer by layer. She introduced a new auditing process built around real-time alerts and manual logic checks at key decision points. She explained the metrics that would trigger escalation. She proposed independent quarterly data reviews, not as a way to point fingers, but to catch silent risks before they snowballed. And she gave them numbers, real projections of how much could be saved over the next fiscal year just by implementing her system. As the slides continued, the tone in the room shifted. Doubt gave way to interest. Pens began to move across notepads. People leaned in. Questions came, sharp ones, meant to test her, meant to corner her, but she answered each without panic. When she didn't know something, she said so, and followed it with how she would find out. She wasn't performing, she was leading. Finally, when the last chart faded from the screen, she closed her folder and looked around the table. "This process will require your support," she said. "Not just today, but consistently. It will be inconvenient at times, slower maybe, but it's designed to protect this company from itself, from the very things we don't know we've missed. And if we get this right, we'll never be in this position again." For a long time, no one spoke. Then, the same board member who had questioned her education during the last meeting leaned forward, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "Where did you say you graduated from again?" She didn't hesitate. "I didn't. My father worked here for 28 years. I learned everything I know by watching this building from the inside out. I cleaned floors before I ever studied a spreadsheet. I didn't come from a university. I came from here." A murmur moved through the room, quiet but audible. Then Douglas Blake stood. His voice was calm but unmistakably sharp. "Her education came from the very ground this company was built on, and today she taught this board something none of us saw. In my career, I've reviewed thousands of resumes, hired hundreds of professionals with top-tier credentials. But today, none of that mattered. What mattered was who caught the truth." The chairman of the board stood slowly. She looked at Eliza, then at the rest of the members. "We accept the proposal. We approve the new department under your leadership. Truth and Accuracy Division. Full funding. Full support." Eliza blinked. She had prepared for debate. She had braced for resistance. What she hadn't prepared for was unanimous approval. Someone across the table clapped, just once, then again. Slowly it grew. Not loud, not showy, but solid. Real. She didn't smile, not yet. She nodded once in acknowledgement, then gathered her notes. As she left the boardroom, the tension she'd been carrying for days began to lift. Not all at once, but enough. Enough to breathe. Enough to believe it. Her phone buzzed the moment she stepped into the hallway. A message from her father. "You good?" She stared at it, feeling the lump rise in her throat. She typed back just 2 words. "I'm better." Because she was. She wasn't just fixing errors anymore, she was fixing culture. She was changing the standard. And this time, there was no one left questioning if she belonged, because she just proved it in the only language the board respected. Results. The next morning, the building buzzed with something new, something unspoken but undeniable. Word had spread, not just about the board's decision to approve Eliza's department, but about how it had happened. Executives whispered in elevators. Analysts exchanged glances over their screens. People who hadn't looked twice at her before were now leaning in when she passed by, curious, surprised, maybe even a little awed. The story was everywhere, though no one said it out loud. The janitor's daughter had stood before the board and walked out a leader. Eliza arrived earlier than usual. She didn't want a grand entrance. She didn't want applause. What she wanted, what she needed, was to start, to put her hands to the work and show that what happened in the boardroom wasn't a fluke or a moment of luck. It was who she was, every day. As she stepped through the doors of Bright Tech, something subtle but important happened. The same security guard who had once approached her to escort her out now opened the door for her, gave her a small nod and said, "Good morning, Ms. Monroe." He didn't say it loudly. He didn't say it for show, but the respect in his voice was genuine, and it meant more than he probably realized. The receptionist, too, had changed. She didn't try to make conversation, didn't offer fake warmth. She simply looked up as Eliza passed and said softly, "I didn't know who you were." Eliza paused, looked her in the eye, and replied, "Most people don't." And then she walked on, not bitter, not smug, just honest. She took the elevator to the 22nd floor again, but this time it felt like it was rising to meet her, not lift her up. When the doors opened, she didn't hesitate. She walked straight to the office, now bearing a temporary nameplate, Truth and Accuracy Division, Acting Director E. Monroe. She stood there for a second, just looking at it, her name on a door on the 22nd floor. After a moment, she turned the handle and stepped inside. Her team was already there, 5 people around the table, some still unsure, others slowly coming around. But today they weren't wondering why she was in the room. They were waiting to see what she would do next. She greeted each of them by name, asked about their notes from the last meeting, brought up the pilot audit timeline, and began delegating tasks with a quiet but clear confidence. It wasn't about proving authority, it was about building something real, together. Midway through the morning, a man appeared in the doorway, worn jeans, steel-toed shoes, a face lined by years of quiet work. Her father. He stood there, lunchbox in hand, eyes scanning the room, unsure if he should step inside. Eliza looked up, surprised, and then smiled, a smile that didn't belong to a junior analyst or a department head, but to a daughter. She crossed the room and met him halfway. "You came?" she said softly. He nodded, voice low. "You left early. Thought maybe you didn't get breakfast." She laughed gently and took the lunchbox from his hands. "I saved you a seat at the table," she said. He looked around. Suits, glowing screens, sharp minds, then back at his daughter. "I told you," he said with a small smile. "One day they'd see it." She hugged him, not caring who saw, then walked him to the conference table and poured him a coffee like she used to watch him do for others. Only this time the room stood still. This time no one looked past them. And when her father left, quietly, respectfully, not a soul in that office missed the weight of what had just happened. The rest of the day was a blur of progress. Eliza met with compliance, signed off on internal communication drafts, collaborated with IT to implement audit tools she had helped sketch out. Her name began to appear in email threads between departments that had never even known she existed a week ago. By noon, the pilot audit was officially live. By 3 p.m., her team had already flagged 2 inconsistencies, minor but real. Eliza called a quick meeting, walked them through the issues, and proposed fixes. It wasn't about being the smartest voice in the room. It was about being the one who listened, guided, and made clarity contagious. At 6:15 p.m., she finally stepped away from her desk, looking out the window across the city she used to study from below. Lights shimmered like constellations, and for the first time in her life, she didn't feel like she was trying to break in. She was inside. She was part of the design. Her phone buzzed again. A message from Douglas. Board meeting follow-up was strong. You impressed them. Keep going. She stared at it for a moment, then typed back, "Thanks. We're just getting started." And she meant it, because this wasn't the end of her story. This was only the beginning of what was possible when someone who had been invisible finally got the room to see her, not because of a title, not because of a favor, but because she stood up, spoke the truth, and backed it with something no one could deny. Results, integrity, relentless clarity, and somewhere down in the lobby, someone else might be standing in worn shoes, clutching a folder, wondering if they belong, wondering if anyone will see them. And one day, they just might, because Eliza Monroe opened a door no one could close again.